A waitress helped a Hell's Angels every morning, but one day, his lawyers walked in with 4 bodyguards. The small town of Havenwood was a place where routines were etched into the very fabric of daily life, as predictable and comforting as the sunrise. And for the past 7 years, one of the most intriguing and steadfast of these routines unfolded every single morning at the Rusty Spoon, a diner famous for its bottomless coffee and perpetually steamy windows. It was here, amidst the clatter of ceramic and the sizzle of bacon, that Sarah, a waitress whose smile was as warm as the coffee she served, began her day. Sarah wasn't just a waitress, she was the heart of the Rusty Spoon, a woman in her late 20s with kind eyes, a quick wit, and an uncanny ability to remember every regular's order, often anticipating their needs before they even sat down. Her uniform, a crisp white shirt beneath a practical apron, was always immaculate, a testament to her dedication. Every morning, precisely at 6:30 a.m., a shadow would fall across the diner's entrance, and the bell above the door would announce the arrival of its most unusual patron. He was a man of formidable size, his presence alone enough to quiet the usual morning chatter. His leather jacket, always the same, bore the unmistakable insignia of the Hell's Angels, a winged skull that seemed to glare defiance at the world. His face, etched with a lifetime of stories, was framed by a thick, grizzled beard, and his eyes, often hidden beneath the brim of a worn cap, held a gaze that could either be intensely focused or distantly contemplative. No one in Havenwood knew his name, or at least, no one dared to ask. He was simply the biker, or to the more hushed whispers, the Hell's Angel. He would stride in, a heavy bootfall announcing each step, and settle into the same booth at the back, facing the door. It was a strategic position, offering him a clear view of everyone who entered and exited, a silent sentinel in a world of bustling normalcy. He never spoke a word upon entering, merely offered a curt nod if he caught Sarah's eye, a rare occurrence. Yet, Sarah knew his order by heart. Before he even had a chance to fully settle, she would be there, a steaming mug of black coffee, no sugar, no cream, already placed before him. Moments later, a plate would follow. 2 fried eggs, over easy, crispy bacon, and a side of plain toast, buttered only lightly. He ate with a quiet intensity, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. The other customers, a mix of early-rising construction workers, retirees, and the occasional truck driver, would invariably fall silent for a moment upon his arrival. A collective intake of breath, a subtle shift in conversation, a nervous glance. Yet, Sarah never reacted with fear or even surprise. To her, he was just another regular, albeit one with a more imposing aura. She treated him with the same respect and efficiency she offered everyone else. No special favors, no overt deference, just professional, warm service. This consistency, this unwavering normalcy in the face of such an intimidating figure, was what truly set Sarah apart. She had seen through the leather and the patches years ago, or perhaps, she simply chose to. For 7 years, this routine had played out without variation. He would eat, drink his coffee, sometimes ordering a second cup with a silent gesture, and then, just as silently, he would pay, leaving a generous tip, always in cash. His tips were always considerably more than the average, a silent acknowledgement of her service, or perhaps, a payment for the unspoken peace he found in her diner. He never lingered, never made small talk. His visits were a solitary communion with his breakfast and his thoughts, observed only by the ever-attentive Sarah. Over the years, Sarah had developed her own quiet observations about him. She noticed the way his gaze would often drift towards the window, not looking at anything specific, but rather as if scanning the horizon for something unseen. She noticed the subtle changes in his demeanor, a slightly more furrowed brow on some days, a brief, almost imperceptible nod of contentment on others. She knew he preferred the eggs absolutely perfect, the white set but the yolk still gloriously runny. She knew he hated soggy toast. These were the small details that built a bridge of understanding between them, a silent pact forged over countless mornings. The diner itself was a relic of a bygone era, with its checkered floor, red vinyl booths, and a jukebox in the corner that rarely played anything newer than the 1980s. It was a sanctuary for the weary and the hungry, a place where time seemed to slow down, if only for a few moments. And in this sanctuary, the Hell's Angel found his corner, his daily dose of normalcy, served by the only person who seemed entirely unfazed by his presence. Other waitresses, new hires especially, would often be visibly nervous serving him, their hands trembling slightly as they placed his order. Sarah would often step in, taking over his table with a reassuring glance, a silent assertion that this was her regular. One particularly crisp autumn morning, the air outside carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves, the routine began as it always did. The bell above the door jingled at precisely 6:30 a.m., and the familiar, imposing figure of the Hell's Angel entered. He settled into his usual booth, the worn leather of the cushion molding to his form. Sarah, already with his coffee in hand, placed it before him, her movements fluid and practiced. He offered his customary curt nod, a subtle acknowledgement that was as close to a greeting as he ever offered. The diner was bustling, a lively hum of conversation and cutlery. Sarah moved between tables with practiced ease, refilling coffees, taking orders, exchanging friendly banter with the regulars. It was a typical morning, unremarkable in its comforting predictability. The Hell's Angel ate his breakfast, slowly, deliberately, his gaze occasionally sweeping over the diner, a silent observer in the organized chaos. He finished his meal, pushed the plate slightly forward, and Sarah, anticipating his next move, was already at the counter preparing his check. As she returned, placing the small plastic holder on his table, she noticed, for the first time in 7 years, a slight hesitation in his usual swift payment ritual. He didn't immediately reach for his wallet. Instead, his eyes, usually so guarded, seemed to hold a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of contemplation and perhaps, a hint of something else entirely. The diner door opened again, but this time, the sound wasn't the single, familiar jingle. It was a deeper, more resonant chime, followed by the distinct sound of multiple footsteps. The usual morning chatter didn't just quiet, it died, replaced by an abrupt, stunned silence. The abrupt, stunned silence that descended upon the rusty spoon was so profound it felt as though the very air had been sucked out of the room. Every clatter, every whisper, every sizzle of bacon ceased, leaving only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant growl of a passing truck. All eyes, without exception, swiveled towards the newly opened door. Stepping into the diner, not one by one, but as a cohesive, formidable unit, were 6 men. The first 4 were colossal figures, dressed in dark, impeccably tailored suits that somehow managed to make their already impressive physiques appear even more daunting. Their shoulders were broad, their necks thick, and their gazes, sharp and professional, swept across the diner with an almost military precision, assessing every face, every corner. They moved with a silent, synchronized efficiency, their presence instantly shrinking the familiar space of the rusty spoon. These were not the usual Havenwood patrons, their very bearing screamed of a world far removed from bottomless coffee and friendly banter. They were bodyguards, undeniably, radiating an aura of disciplined vigilance. Behind them, 2 other men entered, equally dressed in expensive, sharp suits, but with a different kind of authority in their stride. They carried slim, leather briefcases, their expressions serious, bordering on grim. One, a man with prematurely silver hair meticulously combed back from a high forehead, held a tablet in one hand, his thumb occasionally scrolling through its contents. The other, younger, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, seemed to be taking in the rustic charm of the diner with a detached, almost disdainful curiosity. These were the lawyers, their expensive shoes clicking softly on the checkered linoleum, a stark contrast to the heavy boots of the Hell's Angel. The collective breath held by the diner's occupants slowly released, but no one dared to resume their conversations. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions, with a palpable tension that mirrored the sudden chill that seemed to have permeated the warm diner. Sarah, who had been about to place the check before the Hell's Angel, froze, the small plastic holder clutched in her hand. Her gaze, usually so steady and observant, flickered between the new arrivals and her regular patron. The Hell's Angel, for his part, remained utterly still. He hadn't flinched, hadn't turned his head a fraction of an inch from his usual forward-facing position. His eyes, however, no longer swept the diner in their usual detached manner. They were now fixed intently on the entrance, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. It wasn't surprise, Sarah realized, watching him closely. It was something closer to recognition, perhaps even an expectation, though tinged with an underlying current of fatigue or resignation. He simply watched them, a silent, unmoving monolith in a suddenly very small pond. The 6 men didn't hesitate. Their formation remained tight as they moved directly towards the back booth where the Hells Angels sat. The 4 bodyguards fanned out, 2 taking positions flanking the booth, their backs to the wall, their eyes still scanning the room. The other 2 stood slightly behind the lawyers, creating a formidable human barrier between the Hells Angel and the rest of the diner. It was a textbook protective maneuver, executed with chilling precision. The silver-haired lawyer stepped forward, his expression formal and unyielding. He didn't look at Sarah, or at any of the other stunned customers. His gaze was solely for the Hells Angel. "Mr. Vance," he stated, his voice a low, clear baritone that cut through the silence like a sharp knife. It was the first time Sarah, or anyone else in Havenwood, had ever heard the Hells Angel referred to by a name. "We apologize for the intrusion, but the matter has become urgent. We need to speak with you immediately." The Hells Angel, now identified as Mr. Vance, slowly, deliberately, pushed his empty plate further away. His eyes, still holding that unreadable quality, finally shifted from the lawyer's face to Sarah, who stood frozen beside him, the check still in her hand. It was a fleeting glance, but in it, Sarah detected a subtle message, not an apology, not a warning, but a silent acknowledgement of the disruption to their shared routine. He then nodded almost imperceptibly towards the check, a silent command for her to complete her task. Snapping out of her stupor, Sarah quickly placed the check down. Her hand, usually so steady, trembled slightly, betraying the sudden surge of adrenaline and confusion within her. She tried to catch Mr. Vance's eye again, to glean some understanding, but he had already turned his full attention back to the lawyers. "The diner is hardly an appropriate venue for discussions of this magnitude," the younger lawyer interjected, his voice sharper, carrying a hint of annoyance. He gestured dismissively at the surroundings, the red vinyl, the checkered floor, the half-eaten breakfasts on other tables. It was an insult, subtle but undeniable, to the very fabric of the rusty spoon. A low growl, almost imperceptible, emanated from Mr. Vance's chest. It wasn't a word, but a sound of deep displeasure that seemed to vibrate through the booth. He pushed himself up, his formidable bulk making the booth groan slightly. He didn't rise completely, merely shifted his posture, leaning forward, his forearms resting on the table. His eyes, now narrowed, fixed on the younger lawyer. "This diner, as you call it, is where I choose to conduct my mornings," he rumbled, his voice a gravelly whisper that nonetheless commanded absolute attention. "And if you wish to speak with me, you will do so here, on my terms." The silver-haired lawyer raised a hand, silencing his younger colleague with a stern look. He maintained his composure, albeit with a visible tightening around his jaw. "Very well, Mr. Vance," he conceded, a hint of reluctant deference in his tone. "However, the details are sensitive. Perhaps a more private corner?" He glanced pointedly at the other customers, who were now openly staring, their breakfasts forgotten. Mr. Vance merely shook his head, a dismissive gesture. "Speak your piece, Mr. Davies," he commanded, revealing both the lawyer's name and a deeper, more familiar relationship than Sarah might have initially assumed. "Here. Now." Mr. Davies swallowed, a flicker of exasperation crossing his face before he regained his professional mask. He opened his briefcase, revealing a stack of thick documents. The younger lawyer, meanwhile, pulled out a small, discreet device from his pocket and swept it around the booth, presumably checking for listening devices. The bodyguards remained unmoving, their vigilance absolute. The sudden intrusion, the formal address, the mention of urgent matters, and the sheer, overwhelming presence of these men had shattered the comforting rhythm of the rusty spoon. Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a protective instinct for her diner, for the quiet peace that Mr. Vance had always brought, even with his intimidating presence. But there was also an undeniable surge of curiosity, a burning desire to understand what shadowy world had finally reached out to claim her most enigmatic regular. She watched as Mr. Vance, the Hell's Angel, the silent sentinel, now sat surrounded, his usual solitary communion completely obliterated. He was still the same man, but now, the layers of his mysterious life were beginning to peel back, revealing glimpses of something far grander, and potentially far more dangerous, than anyone in Havenwood could have imagined. The conflict was no longer just the jarring presence of these outsiders, it was the abrupt collision of two vastly different realities, one mundane and comforting, the other shrouded in power, secrets, and an unspoken urgency. Sarah knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her routine, and perhaps her understanding of the quiet man in the back booth, would never be the same. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation, as Mr. Davies cleared his throat, preparing to unveil the reason for their unprecedented arrival. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation, as Mr. Davies cleared his throat, preparing to unveil the reason for their unprecedented arrival. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden stillness of the diner. Every eye was on the silver-haired lawyer, whose gaze, however, remained fixed solely on Mr. Vance. "Mr. Vance," Mr. Davies began, his voice dropping to a confidential yet audible tone, "we have received final confirmation this morning. The appellate court has upheld the verdict. The will of Elias Thorne has been successfully contested. You are, unequivocally, the sole beneficiary of the Thorne estate." A collective gasp rippled through the diner, quickly stifled by the sheer weight of the moment. Sarah's mind reeled. Elias Thorne. The name, though unfamiliar to her, seemed to resonate with a distant power, a whisper of old money and forgotten legacies. She looked at Mr. Vance, the Hell's Angel, who sat impassively, his hands resting on the table, still as stone. The younger lawyer, whose name was apparently Mr. Reynolds, stepped forward slightly, holding up the tablet. The assets include the Thorne Industries conglomerate, a vast portfolio of real estate holdings across several states, and a substantial trust fund. The estimated net worth, after all legal fees and liabilities, exceeds $900 million. $900 million. The numbers hung in the air, surreal and impossible against the backdrop of the checkered floor and the scent of frying bacon. Sarah felt a faintness wash over her. This man, her regular, the silent biker, was an heir to an empire. The urgency, Mr. Davies continued, stems from the immediate need to secure these assets. The previous claimants, the Thorne family's estranged relatives, are, as expected, less than pleased. There have been overtures. Threats, even. We need you to sign the preliminary transfer documents and authorize the immediate deployment of our security teams to the key properties. Sarah finally understood the bodyguards, the scanning device, the palpable tension. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, and the dangerous world that came with it. Mr. Vance, the man who sought quiet normalcy in her diner, had been living on the precipice of something immense. Elias Thorne, Mr. Vance rumbled, his voice low but cutting through the silence, was a man I respected. A man who understood the value of loyalty, even when it was unconventional. His eyes, for a fleeting moment, held a glint of something akin to memory, perhaps even affection. He saw past the leather, didn't he, Davies? Mr. Davies inclined his head slightly. Indeed, Mr. Vance. Mr. Thorne's will explicitly stated that his estate should pass to the individual who consistently embodied the principles of unwavering loyalty and steadfast character, regardless of societal prejudice or outward appearance. Your long-standing, albeit unconventional, relationship with Mr. Thorne, and your consistent demonstration of these qualities, were central to the court's decision. And then, the silver-haired lawyer turned his gaze, for the first time, to Sarah. His expression softened infinitesimally, a subtle shift from professional sternness to a curious respect. "And Miss Sarah," he added, his voice still formal but with a new warmth, "your role in this, while indirect, has been quite profound." Sarah blinked, utterly bewildered. "My role?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Davies nodded. Throughout the legal proceedings, the opposing counsel attempted to paint Mr. Vance as unstable, erratic, and unfit to manage such an estate. They highlighted his association with the Hell's Angels, his reclusive lifestyle, his deliberate detachment from mainstream society. They argued he lacked the stability, the judgment, to inherit and manage a corporate empire. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. But we were able to present a counter-narrative. A narrative of consistency, of deliberate routine, of a man who, despite his formidable exterior, values peace, order, and genuine human connection. Your diner, Miss Sarah, and specifically your relationship with Mr. Vance, became a cornerstone of our defense. Mr. Reynolds, the younger lawyer, chimed in, less subtly. We submitted affidavits from other regulars, describing the scene here. We had surveillance footage, discreetly acquired, of course, demonstrating Mr. Vance's daily, unwavering routine. And your unwavering service, Miss Sarah. The fact that for 7 years, rain or shine, you provided him with the same order, the same respect, the same unwavering normalcy in the face of his unique presence, it spoke volumes. It illustrated his stability, his predictability, his capacity for consistent, long-term relationships, even if unspoken. It proved he wasn't a recluse by pathology, but by choice, seeking a specific kind of sanctuary. Sarah felt a blush creep up her neck. Her simple acts of kindness, her professional dedication, had been dissected, analyzed, and presented in a court of law. Her daily routine, once a comforting rhythm, now felt like a meticulously documented performance. The opposing counsel tried to dismiss it, Mr. Davies continued, calling it a quirk or eccentricity. But the judge saw it for what it was, a man finding solace and consistency in a world he often found turbulent. He saw the genuine, albeit silent, bond forged over coffee and eggs. And your steadfastness, Miss Sarah, was presented as evidence of Mr. Vance's own sound judgment in choosing such a reliable and good-hearted individual to interact with daily. Mr. Vance finally stirred, pushing himself fully upright. He looked at Sarah, his eyes, usually so guarded, now holding a profound depth. It was not a look of surprise, but of a quiet, almost weary acknowledgement. She knows how I like my eggs, he said, his gravelly voice softer than she had ever heard it. And she never judged. The words, simple as they were, struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. They were the closest thing to an emotional confession she had ever heard from him. All those years, all those mornings, he had seen her, truly seen her, beyond the apron and the orders. Indeed, Mr. Vance, Mr. Davies responded, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. And that, in essence, was the argument. That a man who values such simple, honest consistency, and who finds a haven in it for 7 years, is a man of sound mind and clear purpose. Your generous tips, Miss Sarah, were also presented as evidence of his deliberate patronage and appreciation, not as random acts, but as a consistent, planned investment in his daily calm. Mr. Vance then reached into his leather jacket, not for his usual wad of cash, but for a different, thicker envelope. He placed it on the table, sliding it toward Sarah. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. This, he said, his eyes meeting hers, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch, is for you, Sarah. It's not a tip. It's an acknowledgement. For the peace. For the eggs. For seeing a man, not just a patch. Sarah's fingers trembled as she picked up the envelope. It was heavy, thick with what felt like hundreds of dollars. But it wasn't just money. There was a folded piece of paper inside. She looked at Mr. Vance, then at the envelope, then back at him, her mind struggling to process the enormity of the moment. Mr. Davies, sensing the need for clarity, stepped in again. Mr. Vance, through the Thorne estate, wishes to express his profound gratitude. The small piece of paper inside outlines the establishment of a trust fund in your name, Miss Sarah. It also includes the full ownership of the Rusty Spoon Diner. The current owner, a distant relative of Mr. Thorne who held the deed, has agreed to the transfer as part of the estate settlement. Sarah gasped, the envelope slipping slightly in her hand. The Rusty Spoon. Her diner. The place she had poured her heart into for years. It was almost too much to comprehend. The clatter of ceramic and the sizzle of bacon, the comforting sounds of her life, suddenly felt like a distant echo in the face of this overwhelming reality. The trust fund, Mr. Reynolds added, a hint of professional pride in his voice, is substantial enough to ensure your financial security for life, Miss Sarah. And the diner, free and clear, is now yours to manage as you see fit. Mr. Vance believes that a place of such genuine character and consistent service deserves to be preserved, and that its heart, which is you, should be its rightful owner. Mr. Vance watched her reaction, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He then turned his attention back to Mr. Davies. "The documents," he commanded, his voice returning to its usual gruff tone, but with an underlying current of finality. "Let's get this done. I have a breakfast to finish and a world to reclaim." The lawyers immediately sprang into action, spreading documents across the booth table. Mr. Vance, the Hell's Angel, the silent sentinel, the now unimaginably wealthy heir, began to sign, his large hand moving with surprising precision. The bodyguards remained vigilant, their eyes sweeping the room, but the immediate crisis, the dramatic revelation, had passed. The other customers, still stunned, began to whisper amongst themselves, their voices a low, awestruck hum. Sarah, still clutching the envelope, felt a tear trace a path down her cheek. Not tears of sadness, but of an overwhelming rush of emotions, shock, gratitude, disbelief, and a profound sense of validation. Her quiet life, her simple acts of kindness, had been seen, valued, and rewarded in a way she could never have imagined. Mr. Vance finished signing, pushing the documents back across the table. He then looked at Sarah one last time. "The coffee here," he said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his grizzled beard, "is the best in Havenwood. Don't change a thing." With that, he rose from the booth, his formidable bulk filling the space. The bodyguards immediately formed a protective perimeter around him. He didn't linger, didn't offer any further words. With a curt nod to Mr. Davies and a final, lingering glance at Sarah, he strode out of the Rusty Spoon, the bell above the door jingling its familiar tune, announcing his departure. This time, however, he was followed by 6 imposing figures, disappearing into the crisp autumn morning. The diner, which had been holding its breath, slowly exhaled. The hum of conversation returned, but it was different now, infused with a new sense of wonder and disbelief. Sarah stood by the empty booth, the envelope heavy in her hand, the scent of coffee and bacon still in the air. The Rusty Spoon was still the Rusty Spoon, but for Sarah, and for everyone in Havenwood, it would never be just a diner again. It was a place where kindness had been recognized, where quiet dignity had triumphed, and where a waitress's unwavering service had helped a Hell's Angel reclaim an empire, all over a perfectly cooked breakfast. Sarah looked at the trust fund outline and the deed, a small, triumphant smile gracing her lips. Her routine, she realized, had just changed forever, but the heart of the Rusty Spoon, and her own, remained steadfast.